There's something nice about doing New Yorker interviews where like the quality of the sound doesn't matter at all. So all I have to do, I can just set up multiple. Like I would have that, my laptop, and my phone. I'll just recording just in case.
Right.
Um,
All right. Well, here we are. We're in this really fancy hotel room in Venice, Italy,
we are.
because my brother knows the owner and he hooked me up. And tell me about where you've been staying, though. It's the opposite.
I'm very focused on the present. Yeah, so I guess I'm staying here tonight. Do you want to go back to the insane asylum that I just fled?
Why were you in an insane asylum?
Yeah. So we're in Venice, and just off a little bit, I guess a little bit off the coast, San Servolo.
Servolo.
Servolo. Well, so okay, that's interesting, right? So I'm going to get back to that in a second.
Okay.
Honestly, I want to go back to that. Which I guess was an old Benedictine monastery, and then during times of crisis or plague or quarantine, became a leper colony, became a mental hospital. It's kind of interesting the overlap of isolation. There's like a germ theory of literal disease, right? Like literal kind of viral bacterial plague like disease, where it's like, okay, we need to get the people away because something might hop. And for a vast majority of human history, including probably still the present, there's kind of a germ theory of mental illness too, which is like you still want to keep them isolated. And it's this odd thing where around the world, the like architecture and real estate of former mental hospitals tends to be some of the best in the world, because the very thing that rich people want, seclusion, isolation, barriers to keep the outside out, is exactly the logic of kind of taking societies uncharmed and putting them far away.
But wasn't there kind of an Alcatraz vibe to it as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the point, right? Like you keep them in when it was a mental hospital, when it was a leper colony. Yeah. So it's
Because they were probably a danger, right? I mean, I imagine a lot of them were violent, or
a lot of lepers.
not
Or
the lepers.
the
Oh, sorry, I was thinking the insane.
No, I mean, of like if the literature at least would say that a vast majority of mental illness is kind of the harm is directed inward, the harm is directed to the self. Very rare cases do they end up hurting others. I mean, it does happen, and when it does, it's kind of like, okay, this is going to be a like non-generalizable and possibly horrific metaphor that I'm going to take back eventually. But there's something about the outsized emotional impact of autonomous cars. Like there's tens of thousands of people die or get into car accidents every day, right? And we just kind of accept that. But if a single autonomous car kills a single person, that's national news. There's something outsized about the like kind of brain we don't understand. And I think there's a similarly outsized attachment to violence when committed by someone who has a mental health problem, but a vast majority of violence is committed by, not sane, the non mentally ill.
Our friend Aaron sent me eyes rolling up emoji with the governors of Florida has declared has passed a world Victims of Communism Day that happens to be on my birthday. And Aaron said it's like Black History Month, like the rest of the year is Victims of Capitalism Day.
Right.
And right when he sent that, we landed in San Servolo, and we went to the exhibit of all these mental patients. And at a certain point, there was like 1/3 of Venetians were afflicted by the way it was explained, this move to kind of a proto-capitalist or capitalist system whereby the farmers no longer owned their own land. They became tenants, and were not making enough money to both pay their rent and eat a nutritious diet. And then at the time, the cheapest food to eat was maize or corn, which is a special kind of corn that grows here, I think. And it's they would make polenta, which now is kind of a delicious meal. But if you eat only polenta, it turns out that your brain starts to literally rot. And they had this exhibit with the actual preserved rotting brains of these poor people who were like carted off by the thousands, men on one island, women on another, and then they were treated by the doctors and the priests at the time just horrifically. Like there was just these descriptions of like forced baths that would last like 12 hours, cold baths, hot baths, that this was like thought to be some cure. And then there was they had on display all the medical tools, as well as the, which looked downright medieval, even though it was like 100 years ago. And they had the things they would use to constrain the and it was just really, I found it really traumatizing to look at this exhibit, because you have photos of these people that just look. I also think that, losing your mind is the most frightening thing, way beyond anything physical that could happen. I mean, it is something physical, obviously, but it's different. Like, and if we're going to separate the physical and the mental, I can't imagine any physical, losing limbs or being deformed could never be as uncomfortable as, the times I felt like I've lost my, been losing my mind, whether it was like from a psychedelic or from a panic attack, or just, passing out and waking up confused. Like a state of confusion, a state of not feeling grounded is worse than death, I think, And so just like thinking about these poor people that not only having to deal with their brains rotting, that, physical damage that leads to, mental damage that is then followed by, like dealt with through sadistic cruelty. And, not only just sending people off to an island, but then once they get there, just being treated like worse than cattle.
Yeah, I mean, they learned from hundreds of years of exorcism research, basically, on how to torture someone and how to like remove the inner spirits, remove the demons. And they just applied that logic because, of course, the church was still a kind of consultant. And they bloodlet, they tortured, they gave, I'm just going to call it torture, which is what it was. They gave insulin comas. They put people in insulin comas.
What's that? What's an insulin coma?
It's you cause some sort of like sugar diabetic. You can get into a diabetic coma if you either, I don't know what you inject in a person, but you inject something and you drop their blood sugar or raise it way, way, way high, and they end up in insulin comas. Like they would just induce comas in people with the hope that when they came out, they would be sane. 50 years ago, it wasn't that long ago that even just lobotomies were just regularly practiced, especially in America. Like a guy kind of drove around the country with an ice cream truck and won the Nobel Prize. And it's this thing where, like, what's kind of shocking is, so we were just at a conference that is on that island, or a workshop that took place on that island. And there were like practicing psychiatrists there, one of whom told me that they still do like ECT, and it's actually the most effective treatment for intractable treatment-resistant depression. That's electroconvulsive therapy, and it's shock therapy. It's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and those devices, those machines, were in there, and so there's something. So there's a kind of counterintuitive idea behind this, though, which is that what that seems like is that we have not progressed. We still actually perform lobotomies. When I say we, I mean just as a society, we still do perform lobotomies occasionally. They've just been rebranded as leucotomy, which is the same thing, but just much easier to tell the family and patient. But the biggest difference,
can you explain what a lobotomy and a leucotomy are exactly? They're removing part of the frontal lobe, or?
Well, so the way that it used to be done was to go in through the eyes, the kind of corner of the eye, which gets you kind of the closest access to the brain. And they would put a little ice pick in there with a little hook and just kind of scramble it around. And this was, I think, like late 40s, 46. It was developed in Portugal by Edgar Moniz. And then I think 49, 49, um, it kind of got imported over to the U.S. and was very popularized. And there are these theories that basically, I don't think anyone really understands who's alive today who was not alive during World War II. What that was really like to have the entire planet kind of at war, or much of the planet that had heard of it. There was a very serious sense that man was inherently brutal, and that war was just going to plague us as plagues had, just like kind of recurrently, and every once in a while it's just going to happen again. World War I was abysmal, World War II was abysmal, and then suddenly this guy comes up with a tiny little device that you can just, in 15 minutes, you can turn someone who's angry and raging, and you can turn them docile. And that's what happens after lobotomy. A lot of people were, they remove executive function, they remove the frontal parts of the brain, they just scramble it, which can cause all kinds of horrific brain injuries, including stroke, and just like you damage the tissue there. And they suddenly just kind of stopped being as aggressive or being as outbursty as they were. And it appeared to the doctors like they had found the cure to human violence.
And were they still able to just, I mean, if someone's been lobotomized, how there are they still in terms of like brain function, in terms of like intelligence?
It depends when it's done. So an adult versus a child. So the brain is extraordinarily plastic. It's very able to kind of compensate if it gets injured at a young age. And they were doing these lobotomies. I think Rosemary Kennedy got one when she was a teenager, like 13, 15. I think she was young. I don't know exactly when it was, but I mean, she turned into a kind of emotional zombie. She had to be cared for the rest of her life. She's just done as a human. And like, wow. Your body doesn't deplete. It of course, like you think less straight. You kind of maybe even just have fewer thoughts, whatever that means. We don't really have like a way to quantify that, but whatever it is, the person,
Were there cases of people who recovered from them at all and were able to kind of tell the tale of what it was like?
Oh yeah, there's a horrific book called My Lobotomy by a guy, I think Howard Duffy. He's still alive. He lives in San Jose, California, and he's a bus driver. I think he's retired now, but he was a bus driver for 40 years. And his stepmother, this is like straight out of a fucking grim fairy tale, literally stepmother didn't like him, convinced the Nobel Prize winning doctor to give her stepson, who was troubling her, a lobotomy at age 15. And the book is an extraordinary book where he asks his father 50 years later, like, hey, what the fuck? And he talks very, very bluntly and honestly about how much it changed his life. But he's happily married. He has kids. Has been a bus driver his life, wrote this book. It kind of got picked up and popularized, and he kind of went on a national tour. He became a little folk hero to a lot of people who either knew someone in their family or had one of these themselves. So Hemingway, right, one of the things we did, were like 2 blocks from Harry's bar. I don't know how to do gondola blocks. I don't know if Venice is just 1 block. I don't know. But anyway, we're close.
We should let the audience know this is your first time, not only in Venice, but first time in Italy.
It is my first time in Italy. Yes.
Go on.
So of course I went straight to Harry's bar. And Hemingway got ECT. He got multiple rounds of electroconvulsive therapy. And
to cure his depression?
Yeah, so he had a history of, he had been in the War One, had, I think, crashed a plane somewhere epic and manly, and ended up with a really bad concussion. So he had a history of head injury. He had, I believe, had a history of depression as well. I can't say coincident with or in conjunction with the traumatic brain injuries, but he had a series of rounds of ECT. The last one being, I think, a couple months before he ultimately shot himself. But in between that last ECT round and when he died by suicide, he said, you've cured the disease, but you've lost the patient. And so there's something I find almost paradoxical about that, which is that that's such a concise, compressed, kind of simple Hemingway-esque sentence. It contains so much and so little. So clearly we didn't lose the patient, or else he wouldn't have been able to come up with that. But there must have been something that was happening on the inside of his head where he just felt it was over.
I have to tell the story again of the strangely similar story of Jean Cocteau with his lover Jean Marais, who got Cocteau to stop smoking opium. Now Cocteau was, unlike my father, who a lot of people said, oh, if only he hadn't smoked opium his whole life, he would have done all of these amazing things. But my father himself would point out that, my dad smoked 15 pipes of opium a day. Jean Cocteau smoked 100 pipes of opium a day and was one of the most prolific artists of the 20th century. He wrote multiple books. He painted everything from paintings to some of the most beautiful drawings I've ever seen, and the inside of a chapel that is one of the most glorious things I've ever seen. He made multiple beautiful classic films. And his lover, Jean Marais, got him to stop smoking opium for 2 years. But after 2 years, he brought the plateau, which is the tray that the opium would be prepared on, and the pipe, and there was a little oil lamp, and he brought all these things back to him, and he said, I saved the man, but I killed the poet. And he said, it's okay, I love you the way you are, and you can go back to smoking because it's obviously part of it. Anyway, parenthetical tale that my father used to tell. Go on.
There's a short story writer from New Zealand who was about to get, I believe, ECT. It could have been a lobotomy. It was that's like the top tier of invasiveness. And the doctors canceled. So she published, but kind of nominally. She was not world famous, and she was back home in New Zealand. And I think days before the operation was meant to happen, she won a major literary prize for her fiction, and the doctors called off the operation. So, like, whatever that is, it means deep down they knew, right? Deep down they well,
as a culture, we allow drug addiction and all sorts of kind of behavior in people who are
amongst what? The successful? I mean that's what's so fucked up, is that there is no, rather that's what's so both difficult and simultaneously fucked up about this. And when I say this, I mean specifically our understanding of our tolerance for mental illness within our society is that we care about the success condition. Like, why is it the case that just making your family happy does not count as success, whereas winning a literary prize does, so as to stop the operation? Like there's no objective measure. To this day, there's a new diagnostic and statistic manual, DSM, the one that came out sometime in the last decade. There's not a single biomarker in it. There's not a single objective classification. It's really hard.
It's all subjective kind of behavior descriptions.
Yeah, and I mean that's not to say statistics is not used, but it's affect, it's behavior, it's how the person behaves. And so when I said I wanted to get back to the accent being wrong, right? San Servolo.
Servolo.
So here's the thing. What do you think the number one non-genetic risk factor for schizophrenia is?
Non-genetic
risk factor. So risk factor being it's associated with schizophrenia. That if you have a population of people that have this risk factor and a population of people without this risk factor, the one with have X% higher chance of also having schizophrenia.
Would there be, is diet?
One. No. Diet's in there, I think, but I think it's similar actually to the polenta one. There's a certain kind of deficiency.
Right.
But that's somewhere in the low teens in terms of risk factors. Being a migrant.
Really?
Is number one. So what I find so interesting about this is how, this is my first time in Italy. I once stayed for a week as well on Lake Geneva. There's a current mental hospital, but it's been around. It was an old sanatorium back in the mid 1800s called Hôpital Série. And when I was there, there were two things that were funny. So I would meet with, there's a schizophrenia research center, and I would meet with the director every other day or about every day. We'd get coffee and lunch. And so I'd go and I'd meet her in her office, and then we'd go to the cafe. And I would, at the time I was a young buck, I would have my espresso before my meal. So I'd go into the cafe and I'd go straight to the coffee place and I'd get an espresso, and then I'd drink it, and then I'd have the meal. And at day 2, she was like, I just got to stop for a second. What are you doing? Like, what are you doing? You have your espresso after. This was my like European enculturation. I'd been to Europe, but I had never like looked at anything or learned anything. And there was another thing where I kept leaving her office door unlocked. And I was like, so she kind of had a check-in with me, and she's like, look, you're doing 2 things wrong. You're drinking your espresso before your meal, and you keep leaving my office door unlocked. And I was like, what? And so it turns out that she had expected, because when we were leaving the room, if and when I was the last one out, she expected me to lock the door.
Mm-hmm.
And I, an American, we respect property rights, and we expect there to be like an asymmetry. If it's her stuff, it's her door, she can lock it. So these, you think of these as innocent, but then now let's imagine the scenario where you're a migrant and you're taught that, you might learn the language, but there are hundreds of thousands of small cues that give someone away that they're different. And for a disease or for a diagnosis of behavioral, linguistic, or mental difference, it can be, it's like there's a lower barrier for entry for migrants because there's so much that's actually different. Personal space, the amount you get, like how close you are to someone, whether or not you lock their door, there's so many social rules in a new place.
Particularly Italians are so, these markers of like, the most progressive Italian will be very, I make fun of it and call it reactionary, but it's just a treating these mores with a sanctity that Americans just cannot comprehend. Someone laughed the other day of like, oh, I'm being so bad, I'm having a cappuccino after lunch or something. I don't think an American could understand how profoundly an Italian cringes at these, departures from the way it's supposed.
Absolutely.
And there's a rich tradition of Neapolitan folk songs that I was very obsessed with for many years. And there's, songs from 1200 to about 1960 that have become part of the tradition. And one of the most moving songs in any medium, but of these Neapolitan songs, is called Neapolitan Tears. And it's the song takes the form of a letter being written by an Italian immigrant who's gone to the United States. And he's writing, I could start crying just telling the story if I could remember it properly. But I used to just I felt this kind of longing for the my homeland, even though it was like I was half Italian and I would come back and forth. It was nothing like the experience of these poor immigrants. But I would feel this longing for this culture that felt like deep and real, and all these kind of conservative traditions. When they're politically, I have problems with conservatism, but with like traditions that are like, quote unquote harmless, or not even quote unquote, they are harmless. I think they do a lot more good than harm. So the writer of this letter, that I don't know if it was ever a real letter or a fictional one, but basically he says, he's writing to his family, and he says Christmas is about to come, and he wishes that he could be there, but he's alone in New York, and so he says, make the manger for my children, and just when it's the night of Christmas Eve, just pretend that I'm there, and he says, at the end, there's a whole story about him like just longing to be there, wanting to be with his family for Christmas, and then he says the last line is like, "I am nothing but minced meat. I'm an immigrant." So like it's just like he's become nothing, and it's just this story of like intense longing for the culture that was here, and that he lost on. I'll have to play it for you one day and like actually translate it word for word, because it's like very moving, and it's like I understand. I never knew this, that it could be tied so much to mental health issues, but I very much understand how that could be the case.
Yeah, there's a whole fascinating research field going back like 100 years trying to unpack why that is, whether or not it's select. I'll just give a few possible interpretations. One of them, just because it's such a strange fact, that what I don't want people to think is that the first thing that came to their mind as an explanation is something that people haven't thought of, because it is. That there's something called selective flight, where so basically the number 2 and number 3, by the way, are these again are non-genetic risk factors, odds ratios for schizophrenia, are living in a city, and the number 3 is growing up in a city, and they scale with the size of the city.
Oh, interesting.
By a very small amount, but they do scale with the size of the city. There's even something called a Tolstoy effect, which is that for an individual, this is really hard to do because you're doing a control condition within an individual. It's very hard to kind of, in the epidemiological world, to like have someone induce something and then have it removed, which is people move to cities and then leave. And apparently the Tolstoy effect, is that the risk increases after they move to the city and decreases when they move back. And so there's this whole, one theory is selective flight, which is that for whatever reason, people, when they are migrants, they tend to go towards cities for industrial reasons, for just social reasons, for, I don't know, like local minima, or just diffusion reasons. They end up in cities. That's just where the trains go, maybe. Who the hell knows? But that it's the people that are disconnected from their home life. It's the people that are disconnected for some reason from their community in which they were born into, that they leave. The idea being that they were maybe predisposed to something, or they didn't fit in. They felt alienated wherever they were for some reason. So the cities tend to be places that aggregate people that don't really belong. Mm-hmm. That's the simple version of the idea. And others being like the actual transit itself is kind of stressful. Stress being one. Cities are extremely stressful, dangerous, loud. There's something called an immunological shock, where people think that one possibility is that your immune system, basically we can travel anywhere in the world within 24 hours, like almost anywhere in the world within 24 hours, to any major society on this planet, you can get to within 24 hours, which is nuts. And our immune systems did not evolve to have that variation that rapidly. Right. We're supposed to slowly walk from like pollen field to pollen field, as we swing through the trees. We're not supposed to take a jet and end up somewhere new. And so there's this concept of immunological shock, that maybe the immune system is not meant to reset entirely to like new pathogens.
By the way, I think I really butchered the song and didn't get at the emotiveness. So if you want to look for it, there's a guy named Roberto Murolo, Murolo, who sings. I used to have it. So it was a 12 CD set, and it went from the year 1200 to the 1956. And the song is called Lagrime Napoletane, which means Neapolitan Tears. And I'm sure if you Google it, there must be a translation out there. And I highly recommend finding this guy who sings them so beautifully with just the guitar. A lot of these old Neapolitan songs would get butchered by being played in a kind of restaurant style with an orchestra. But the simplest, most pure form is just a guy with a guitar or a woman with a guitar just singing the songs in the most simple way. So Murolo, I highly recommend people look him up and feel the depth of the Italian culture, or at least that very particular subset of the Italian culture. Of course, everybody thinks Italy is one country because it's so rich in tradition, but we're in Venice, and it's a completely different culture from Rome, where I grew up, which is a completely different culture from Naples, which is just a couple of hours away. You talk about like the difficulty of moving from one place to another. It would take, when my great-grandfather, who was alive until the 1950s, would go from Rome to Vignanello, where our family's places. It was 50 miles away, and they would take 3 days to go. Right. And he said, when the day comes that people spend less than a day going from Rome to Vignanello, that will be a world I don't want to live in anymore. Because he thought that would be too fast of a transition from the Roman culture to the Vignanello culture, which were completely different. The accent was different. The food is different. The way of life is different. And these were like independent, basically, city-states. And there's no way a person my father's age, who was born in 1924, who spoke, traditional Roman dialect, would go to Naples, would not understand one word of what they're saying. So not only is the food and everything is different, including the language. And Venetian is more different from Roman than Italian is from French. I mean, there's nothing in common. And so it's just as we get faster, some of these meaningful differences get dissolved too. We saw this great exhibit of Lena Herzog of like the vanishing languages and what happens when languages disappear. Amongst the vanishing languages are these dialects that are languages. We call them dialects now, but the fact that it's Italian as a language is an arbitrary political fact. When Italy was united by Garibaldi in the 1860s, they decided very much for kind of status and political reasons that proper Italian is Florentine spoken by a Roman, and that was just mandated. That's Italian. That's what counts as Italian.
And there's a way of thinking that's mandated as well
by language, right?
Partly by language, yeah. But I mean, there's an autocratic declaration of this is how it is to think. In the
back to mental health
well,
bills.
Yeah,
yeah, of course. Yeah, we took a big detour. But I do think it's fascinating that it went from a monastery, and then it went to an insane asylum, and now it's a school, and it's various schools.
You
right?
skipped leper colony.
Oh, leper colony as well. And I talked to Christoph Koch earlier today, who's one of the organizers of this consciousness conference, from a neuroscientific point of view, and I felt very lucky to be included because I was the only non-neuroscientist there, and so I was slightly fish out of water, but also, and a lot of the talks were over my head, very technical things. But as I talked about with Christoph this morning, is that there's consciousness is it's the basic primordial fact about human existence and possibly other sentient beings' existence, and we can think about it from many perspectives. We can think about it from a religious perspective. We can think about it from a medical perspective. We can think about it from a philosophical perspective, and we can think about it from a scientific perspective. And each one of those will kind of reveal different truths about, and untruths, I'm sure. It'll obscure certain truths, right? So I want to ask you the same thing I asked Christoph. Like, should we privilege the scientific approach to studying consciousness, or is there just as much truth to be gleaned from a more, a literary perspective, or a medical perspective, or a philosophical perspective? Or are we making just progress? Are we just better today at thinking about these things than we were 300 years ago?
Well, what's so hard to disentangle is actually the borders between those, because William James, the psychologist in the late 1800s, for example, came up with the phrase, or was the first to use the phrase, or came up with a version of it, stream of consciousness. But he was deeply enmeshed in religious thinking, so he came out of, came from hundreds of years, thousands of years of kind of tradition of Western tradition about thinking about the body and the soul and the mind as separate from the thing, so like to say that there is a very clean line between the religious version, which actually influenced William James, who influenced his brother Henry James, so the literary version, which people, you could probably search stream of consciousness in PubMed, the kind of database of all scientific articles, and find scientific articles about, well, why is it a stream? Why doesn't it sit as still as a tree, as Dorothy Richardson once said? So I get the point of the question, but there's also something where it would be extremely difficult to actually find, and this is a kind of scientific inquiry, but it would be extremely difficult to find a single scientific theory which could not trace some bits of its past to religion or literature, or the way in which like the West became the West, or the way in which the East became the East.
Yeah, I think
They're
it's a big
embedded.
mistake that, I mean, my beef with some scientists is they think that
Uh-oh.
they can derive ethical principles or approaches from science. I think science can inform certain goals, but the science won't give you the goals. And so when Christoph, decided that, maybe we, if we don't now, maybe one day we will have hard scientific evidence that animals suffer. But then the fact that we shouldn't inflict suffering is never going to be a scientific fact. That's going to be an ethical choice that we make. And then, the philosopher Hume, who was one of the greatest philosophers that we've ever known, said this simple thing that you'll never derive an ought from an is. And I think
I like the version of that. Well, I think it's a version of that, which is you can blame your parents for your pain, but you can't blame them for the pain you cause.
okay, I'm not sure how it follows from what I was just saying, or how's that a version of you can't derive an ought from an is?
Well, it's about whether or not it was more 2 steps back, which was like I don't know if there'll ever be scientific evidence for the pain and suffering of other creatures, but we can presume it. Rather, to inflict it, there's a philosophical stance at the heart of, do I inflict pain on an animal or another person in a psychic or physical way? But ultimately, like, you ought to infer that they can feel pain much as you can.
Yeah, but even if you do, the fact that you shouldn't inflict pain on other things is not a self-evident fact.
No, not at all.
And it's not a fact. It's an ethical fact, I guess. But it's one that I think requires these other approaches. And I was delighted to see how, it's mathematicians famously think of mathematics as beautiful. I didn't know that neuroscientists would so often be describing their not only their findings, but even the data themselves as beautiful. It was like the adjective most often used to describe the neurons firing. And I mentioned this to somebody, and they're like, "Well, have you ever seen a neuron fire? It's really beautiful." And I was like, there's a defensiveness or an offensiveness almost, like, Christoph said, 2,400 years and philosophers haven't made any progress. There's all these books by the most intelligent people who have ever lived. And what does it give us? And I think the answer to that is it gives us the backbone with which to, how to digest the information that science could give us. Like, there has to be a philosophical underpinning, and we argued about this a bit too. So you can present the other side if you'd like. But I think Dan Dennett said, if a scientist says he's not a philosopher, he's just a scientist who doesn't question his philosophical foundations.
Yeah. So let's use the case of the immorality or respective morality of lobotomy or ECT. The techniques are the same or extremely similar now as they were back 70 years ago. The difference is in the selection criteria for who gets it. The technology itself has advanced like kind of the way that all technologies advance. But the real progress has actually been made in our hesitancy now to give it to people who don't need it. Mm-hmm. And science was able to tell you that. Slow scientific progress was able to tell you that. That was accelerated by the moral horror when the kind of consequences of these procedures kind of made it out into the public. So again, to the point about like, let's differentiate scientific inquiry versus religious inquiry versus literary, like the morality pushed science to be better. The science started a thing, went way too far. Morality pushed back. Science has empirically improved, like our vague understanding of, let's narrow down what we consider to be success in this, and let's narrow down what we consider to be who's relevant.
Bertrand
or
Russell
other
said the
who's-
good life, the definition of the good life is it's inspired by love and guided by knowledge. So I think if you have just love and you don't know what the hell you're doing, you're going to hurt people inadvertently, right?
So,
But you need the love as the underpinning, or the aesthetic, the whether it's a love of beauty, a love of truth, or a love of other sentient beings. But there has to be this kind of emotive, like, care.
yeah.
And the science is never going to tell you what or who you should care about. Then it can, once the love points you in the right direction, then yes, scientific inquiry is the greatest tool we have for discovering what works. The problem with like a religious approach is that it's not grounded in like a correspondence to truth.
I mean, it is in the sense of it's about which authority figure you choose to believe. Like, so we heard a lot of lectures about epilepsy this week, right? Epilepsy has been around for a very long time, and it has been classically kind of thought of, especially in the religious context, if a nun has epilepsy or a priest or something, as that person's closer to God, that person sees visions. It's like a very certain form of temporal lobe epilepsy. And that is still evidence-based, I'm going to even dare say medicine. Like it was about your scripture and your belief system, and it was about whether or not someone's behavior can be folded into that or not, and about whether or not the anomaly can be explained and how we should explain it. And you know, it's kind of odd to think about the fact that there were certain people that presumably had schizophrenia in 1500 and 1600, or back in the day, that had much better lives for it because it was the church who took them in, who actually was able to give them a social construct of meaning, which perhaps encouraged their psychosis to, you know, who knows what end on the inside of their head, but actually revered them instead of put them away. And by no means am I saying that's a good idea. All I'm saying is the way in which you frame it is extremely important. And
what counts as true. I mean, it was for me the most striking story of the whole 8-day conference was the neuroscientist or the neurologist describing how a theoretical physicist self-reported his epileptic fit. And he said, I lost all sense of self. I lost the linearity of time. And, as a scientist, I had to admit that there were two possibilities. One is that I lost touch with reality and my ability to sense reality. And the other, he said, maybe less likely, but definitely a non-zero chance that my brain lost its ability to create the illusion of a self and the illusion of the linearity of time. Because as physicists, they don't prioritize or privilege the present, right? I mean, all of time, there are many models of the universe, like the block universe has past, present, and future, and there's nothing special about this moment, right? So I posted a little synopsis of that, and I got dozens of people writing me on Instagram saying, I have epilepsy. I feel like I see behind the matrix. I feel like the veil is lifted. A lot of ways people describe psychedelic experiences, like the filters is taken up. And, one person claimed that, and this may or may not be true, but she claimed that there's actually more neurons firing during the fit, and therefore maybe, to have people look down their noses and say, oh, you're having an illusion of religious experience seems extremely arrogant, she said. She says, and I think that I'm seeing... And a lot of people who, are dismissive of psychedelic experiences will say like, oh, you're just having an illusory drug experience. And then a lot of people who have the experience say, well, that feels more veridical than what we're seeing every day. And who are we to say that, that this is this conscious experience is revealing the truth and the other ones aren't? Which
is, of course, the debate that like Gnosticism has confronted for thousands of years. Like this is not like it's not new. I mean, every generation needs to think they're doing something new, so more power to them. But these are 1,000-year-old religious debates. So you and I saw the 2019 Gaspar Noé Lux Eterna recently, right? We saw it together.
Yeah.
That attempted to through cinema induce an epileptic fit. It started with a quote from Dostoevsky about the ecstasy of the moment right before you feel the fit coming on, right? And so it's like, this is of course a fascinating version of human experience. And I don't know. So the thing to me to wrap like the science in with the morality is, I am 100% positive. That's a tough one, but I am 100% positive that the way that we treat patients and diagnose today will be considered immoral 100 years from now. Because simply we'll have better tools then. And the things that we do now will be considered maybe like the best one could do at the day, but will be horribly unspecific, non-specific. Like, there are side effects. Like, read the fucking fine print on even on like aspirin. Like every single thing you do, anything you do in a biological system, all these people are all different. We all have different kind of metabolisms and cells and like liver efficiencies. I don't know if we have any like people who've watched this from the beginning. I always like shake my foot, right? I have restless leg syndrome. That's just a gene I have. It's a gene. It's not a personality. It maybe does it lead into anxiety? It certainly looks like anxiety. Is it the feeling that Dostoevsky talks about, like this need to move, this urge to like, kind of flutter around? But I'm sure that the YouTube version of our kind of listeners would interpret it as anxiety or some sort of personality disposition or something different about, versus your kind of calm steadiness when
so
you're
funny.
doing this podcast.
I think the opposite. It's so funny. I think of myself as the antsy one and you as the calm, cool, collected one. Do you really read yourself as the more nervous of the two?
No, my leg specifically.
Just your leg.
Yeah.
But the rest of you is much calmer.
Well, in part
your voice, your beard.
Well, the beard, yeah.
The beard helps give a kind of gravity to anything you say.
The beard, by virtue of its existence, wins me at least like 2 to 3 arguments a day. By virtue of its absolute severity, and all the white men on the portraits we see, in the hallowed halls of academia, they all have beards like this. So
I want to ask you, like, did you learn anything new this week?
Yes, I learned a lot new. There's one particular fact that I'm trying to wrap my mind around. One would be like a thing that I would put into some sort of like essay or piece, which is that there has a great issue in the like literal study of consciousness field, like neurologists who are dealing with people with head injuries or they've had strokes or heart attacks where they drowned and they had hypoxic events, and you're trying to determine if they are in coma, in a vegetative state, in a minimally conscious state, or awake. It's not easy, and the tools are developing and the kind of diagnostic criteria are developing. There's 2 things I loved about that. One, I learned that there's become a standardization in the field where if you're trying to determine if a brain is listening, basically can interpret sound, you want to look at the brain activity. So you stick them in a scanner, and someone said that the new standard is to play an Alice in Wonderland audiobook to everybody. They've homogenized it. They've done the same thing, and so I just find it kind of like a strange detail of society that the one piece of acoustic input we've chosen to use, the doctors have chosen to use, is Alice in Wonderland on audio tape.
But why?
I don't know. Yeah, what I love about it is partly the mystery. Another thing similar I loved, so basically someone is, again, kind of in a vegetative state. You want to know if kind of the lights are on. They used to hold up a $20 bill or money in front of them and move it back and forth.
I remember this. This is great.
And as like people find money valuable or salient. But that finally someone did an empirical study and actually was like, you know what, let's figure out what actually is the most salient thing. And that the most salient thing to hold in front of someone and move back and forth is a mirror.
Yeah, this is the to clarify, like to see if somebody will move their eyes you're not sure if they're unconscious or minimally conscious, right? You want to just like get their attention and see if their eyes will follow something. So it used to be a $20 bill, and then they found that a mirror is much more. This is kind of a sad fact about our narcissism, though, or no, it's just it's not that. It's just like, I guess. Well, especially if you've had an accident or something, it must be shocking to see yourself or wonder like where.
I actually wouldn't, from first principles and not knowing too much about this and not seeing the study, I wouldn't actually expect it to be that different than holding a face in front of the person. It's actually just there are specific areas of the brain that respond to faces and eye contact. We're social primates. We pay attention to eyes. So I actually would guess that it's not so much about the kind of narcissists inside us all.
Oh, it's me. Hello, me. There was so much about recognizing faces. Like our consciousness is what's that?
I mean, yeah. So like, in part, that's because it's one of the like great success stories of neuroscience. Is we lately, which, to be fair, we haven't had many successes. Is we found the face area, which is like, oh my God, these probably mammals, probably everything of sufficient complexity. Or a sufficiently complex nervous system, but especially mammals and especially primates, there's like a face area of the brain. You show someone a face, the face area lights up. And it's just like, I don't know, I always imagine this Babylonian era kind of thing, which is just like, all right, yeah, you show someone a face, there's a face area. Like, okay, that's after, like, the 1990s was the decade of the brain. It was supposed to be the decade of the brain. We're going to solve it. We're going to figure it all out. The fMRI was new. It was supposed to be this like Galileo with his telescope. And 30 years later, it's like, yeah, if you show someone a face, the face area lights up. And of course, it's more nuanced than that. And of course, it's interesting. And there's beautiful
stuff. And there's individual neurons. I mean, that was pretty interesting that we have like individual neurons for individual faces, right? Although this was problematic.
Well, that's not how that goes.
Can you enlighten
that's Christoph's Christoph's work. It's Christoph and Dr. Itzhak Fried's work, and whoever else was in their lab at the time, which I don't know. There's 20 years of bad like interpretation of those. Like no person who did the science would say something like that, but it's like so rare for that there's a mapping of one neuron to one person. Like that doesn't make sense on a physiological level, on a metabolic level, on even like an activity dependent level. But it's such a compelling headline that it went around the world instantly. And there's not a single scientific paper that would stand up to like.
But there was like confirmation of it in one of the talks. They talked about like the different neurons that lit up when they saw specific faces, whether it was Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, and then the blend of the two. And
I mean, this is like it's been on Time, on Newsweek, and
no, but I'm saying everyone, it was in this conference. How is what we heard the other day so
because
different from this?
It is still true that you have activity that is unique. Activity across it's called an ensemble of neurons, like an orchestra of neurons, that is unique for a person. Otherwise, you have to, like by definition, otherwise all faces would look the same.
Right.
Like you have to be able to discriminate what the outside world is trying to tell you to discriminate, or else things will look the same by virtue of them looking different, which all faces do. Therefore, there's a representation in the brain, which of course is different.
I see.
So, but the idea of one neuron, one person is an artifact of the fact that at the time we can't record from all the neurons.
And so I feel like there's 3 levels of experience that we had here. There was the official lectures. There was the meals and coffees and drinks, which were also fabulous. And I'm hoping that we're going to have one of the world's best martinis again, maybe after this podcast. And then there was your experience of Venice and Italy. What can you riff a little bit on the way each of these 3 has changed you, or what you've, how you feel improved by the by
Yeah.
this last 8 days?
I have two stories. One, I guess the monks. Okay, so what are we in? What's it called? The Gritti Palace or whatever. This did not used to be a Benedictine monastery. I promise, because this has space for days. My
Oh yes, you got to describe your room.
my room is a bit monkish. The approximate square footage of your couch is the approximate square footage of my room.
Monkish is putting it romantically. It was almost cellish.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was a leper colony and mental hospital. I was staying in a room that was formerly, this.
I was very jealous that I was really happy to be included in the conference, and I had FOMO when he said, "Well, you can't stay on the island." And then the moment I saw your room, I was like, "Thank God, I'm not staying on the island." Go on.
Well, so this is actually though how you develop empathy, Tao. So
I had lots of empathy for you, but still really glad that I wasn't.
Sorry. Let's put it empathic progress. Let's put it that way. Which is to say, I was in this room, but I loved waking up on the little island and walking around, and I also struggled mightily. And one of the ways I struggled mightily was it's just full of mosquitoes. I don't know why Venice hasn't solved this.
Imagine a cell that was made to feel even smaller by the ridiculously high ceilings. So it just was so disproportionate. And then the cot looked like it was 6 inches thick, and and you're used to kind of austere conditions. You sometimes impose these on yourself. I think that definitely if anyone could handle this, it was you. But when I saw it looked like I was surprised there wasn't a toilet in the room.
I would like to be someone that wishes I could be as resilient as I thought I was. If it was the case that I used to be able to handle austere conditions, it is no longer the case. I broke.
You broke on this trip?
Yeah. You were
Go on.
You were the victim of part of it.
Oh, yes. Don't remind me.
So I wanted air. But if you open the window, there's mosquitoes. So I thought I had a single room, but it turns out I had 15,000 roommates, which were, and so there's a funny thing though, where in the middle of the night, so you're jet lagged, you're on 3 hours of sleep progressively, 3 nights in a row. And the mosquitoes, so you go during the day and you're being told that mosquitoes are conscious, and then you go back into your room and you're like, for the love of God, for the love of whatever is out there, can I please kill the mosquitoes?
Only Christoph thinks the mosquitoes are conscious.
No, a lot of people think the mosquitoes are conscious.
Really?
Yeah, panpsychism is a true and also, I mean, people who study flies think flies are conscious, like a lot of people do. I do.
Okay.
I just have a line in the sand where I'm happily willing to just don't come at me.
Right.
if they were, so I did also find a spider in my room, which I then made friends with, and peacefully was like, okay, now we're on the same team. It's us versus the fucking mosquitoes. So, but here's the thing that was the moment of empathy, which I would not have. I mean, perhaps in here you have empathy for Marie Antoinette, but I was able to develop empathy for what it was like to be trapped in this mental hospital. And what I found so interesting was I basically one night in particular, there's a tiny little ledge out the window, and I needed to seal all the holes on the curtain. So I was in my underwear and standing out 3 a.m. On the precipice of this ledge. It's 6-inch ledge. If I fell, I would have been seriously injured. And I'm trying to basically sew this curtain shut to keep the mosquitoes out. And I'm kind of yelling and ranting. And I find it to be a lot easier to kill a mosquito or locate a mosquito by sound rather than sight, because they move in this Brownian staccato motion that my eyes just can't do the focal plane thing. They always disappear. I find them impossible to hunt. And so I decided to turn out the lights, and I would just stand in the middle of the room listening for them. And then so I would kind of with my eyes closed, monkish, I suppose. But I would then stand very, very still and try to make an extremely quick slap of my hands somewhere in the space around me. When I was laying on my bed, if they buzz in your ear, you'll do this thing where you'll go from perfectly quiet, peaceful slumber to just smacking yourself in the head within like 500 milliseconds. And I realized, like, if there was a security camera, CCTV from like me, you know, kind of like low resolution, and someone 70 years ago when this was a mental hospital, it's like not clear what the difference is on that behavior. On a certain behavioral kind of path, it would not be clear what the difference is. Like, I know that were you not able to see the mosquitoes, and believe me, I did think many times, like, I hope to God those mosquitoes were real, and this isn't like a Shutter Island thing. That, like, you know, so it was something about like resolution. So like literally I was thinking about it from a CCTV camera point of view, because without the resolution of the camera able to detect the mosquitoes, I would have looked insane. But if you had a clear enough camera, you would have been like, oh, he's hunting mosquitoes, right? And the resolution of our tools matters in neuroscience, and we do not currently have the resolution of tools to be able to understand what the difference is between anxiety and OCD, or depression and suicidal ideation, or a voice on the inside of your head, or schizophrenia, where those same voices, which we all have, it kind of turns on you. So that was kind of interesting.
Second story.
Right. I did. Yeah, I never solved the first story. That's kind of the problem. So yeah, do you remember the? There was one. Oh, do I have my bag here? No, I don't have my bag. Anyway, Venice is a maze. Venice is the most beautiful city I've ever been in. Like, you hear that,
It's the most beautiful city in the world.
Yeah, I heard that a bunch. I've read, you know, Italo Calvino. I know he was inspired by Venice. I had heard that, but I never believe other people. I just don't. I figured it was like.
And Patrick was like, he gets stubborn sometimes and wants to put on blinders, and he's like, I'm just gonna focus on this. I'm gonna stay on this island. I'm like, Patrick, you gotta go. And then I would like just ask him to just turn his head to look at something. And be like, don't make me look at things. I would be like, please. I know I'm being annoying, but you've got to look at this. And then you would kind of begrudgingly say, okay, that was worth looking at.
Well, no, I did stop at the top of the Grand Canal, because you were like, look, it's the Grand Canal. But I think that was because I was tired. So I gave you a moment. Yeah, well, so like my brain is doing other things than experiencing like joy from incoming sensory streams. It truly is. Like, I'm either like trying to frame or think about a story or something from the past, or what could happen in the future. I don't know. This has been a kind of continual and perpetual theme and problem in my life.
Calvino said, "La vita o si vive o si scrive," which means life, either you live it or you write it. So he was dealing with the tension of like, you can't do both. You have to, but obviously you have to have lived in order to write. So it's this paradox as a writer that you have to. Are you getting input or output? Right?
Yeah.
Which are you focusing on?
Yeah. No, actually,
it's like neurons.
I really love that. So one of the presentations we saw was by a neurosurgeon, and he had this kind of VR device or setup with patients in his I don't know the same word, in his hospital, and basically he was recording their neurons while they navigated through this virtual maze. It was kind of like a video game, but it was, I think, VR, and it was just random. Like, you're dropped like a mouse into the beginning of the maze in this game, and then the person has to find. There's one nugget of gold somewhere in the maze. And so they're wandering around. There's no reason to know whether or not it's left or right or straight. You don't know where to go. And then as soon as you find the little piece of gold, you reset back to the beginning of the maze. And you're supposed to, it's called like dead reckoning in the field. You're supposed to find your way immediately with the shortest path to that. Based on all the exploration you did, can you go and find where that gold was? And then you're supposed to put a little X on the ground to say, this is my guess. This is where I think it was. And so when I saw that, that morning, or earlier that day, I had walked to a cafe that I had always wanted to go to since grad school. They had one in Palo Alto, Cafe del Doge. And there were 4. There was supposed to be one in Venice, which was the original, and there was one in Tokyo, one in Paris, and one, the outlier, in Palo Alto. And so there was something about going there that made me feel like I hadn't sacrificed too much by going to grad school in Palo Alto that I felt some connection to these large cities, Tokyo, Venice, Paris, Palo Alto, and I would get these like Venetian cappuccinos, and I would love it. And I wrote much of my dissertation there. I have so many positive memories. Multiple people actually have sent me photos of them when they visited Venice. They went to visit Café del Doge and send me a photo of the sign of them in front of it to be like, hey, I was here.
And in contrast, most of your other most other places in Stanford have negative valence, right?
Yes, that's what I mean. Yeah. So this was a like survival mechanism for me in grad school, was this particular cafe, and I knew I was going to go. So I actually walked with Christoph one morning, and we used my phone. So it was my first time stepping foot into Venice. Like, I was on the island. I took a boat straight to the island. So first time on Venice, we were like, let's go, please, to this cafe. And we do. And it's winding, and we get lost, and there's dead ends, even with the phone, because he had not been in Venice either. So we're just lost. We run into bridges. We run into gondolas. We don't know how to navigate anything at all. None of the landmarks make sense. It turns out the graffiti on the wall is instructional. I now know that.
In what sense?
There are graffiti things that say like Rialto Arrow.
Oh, I didn't know
in fucking spray paint.
I didn't know
And
that.
so, but as I was like, scanning for signs, just the signs of the culture, I just didn't see at first, So we got so lost, but eventually made it. And this is with GPS assistance, right? And when I saw,
it gets confusing. The streets are so narrow that it gets confused itself, I think, with the buildings and.
Yeah. Well, and I loved it though, right?
Yeah.
Like, I loved it. It felt so fun to be lost in this like maze-like way.
You like feeling like one of your experimental mice.
Exactly. I like feeling like one of my mice. And so the next morning, I took the 7:05 ferry, because what I did was I put my phone away, and I decided to try to dead reckon. So I had found my gold, right? I had gone through the maze. I had found my gold. And the question is, the next morning, could I restart, and could I get there on my own? And I got so lost. And I could tell at some point that I had overshot massively. And so I gave up. And I marked a little X where I was, like how far I had missed. And then the next morning, through no further effort, so I guess one thing I had done, which is I had found it again and then gone back. But the next morning, through 7 hours of sleep and what I presume to be like thousands of simulated hours of rehearsal in my head as I fell peacefully asleep.
The mosquitoes had gone to torture another soul, or?
Oh, no, they were there. The peaceful was ironic.
Oh, okay.
I took a lot of Benadryl.
Okay.
And I just, without understanding at all why, without being conscious of why, without knowing why I was turning left or right, just knew how to get there. Like so it took 2 days, right? And there was some sort of joy. I felt ecstatic joy. like these are the simple things that I appreciate that in life, because this whole conference, right, is about being consciously aware of something. And there's something so beautiful to me about like the skill acquisition that just happens through experience, that we actually aren't necessarily like phenomenologically aware of. It just happens. I just somehow knew and now I just know, and I don't know how I know. And I just love that so much. And it felt so fun to have like someone present data from the study, show exactly where in the brain this is happening, which are probably the grid and place cells. And then for me to like enact it on the maze of the Venice streets. And so to me, that's I feel like I lived my own Calvino story.
We'll wrap up soon, but I have one curiosity, because several times on this adventure, you've self-identified more as a writer than a neuroscientist. And, I think you have the credentials to call yourself either or both, but you seem to prefer to identify as a writer. But now you're here with a bunch of neuroscientists doing, what was one of your original crafts. if you can call neuroscience a craft. And I've been thinking a lot about the kind of layers of explanatoriness. What's the word I'm looking for?
Explanation?
Explainability. I'm
Okay.
thinking of
Yeah.
like that are not mutually exclusive, right? So like Roger Scruton, has this dismissive attitude towards the neuroreductionists, he calls them, right? And he thinks that they're missing something so essential by looking at this atomized, data instead of what the, complete human does. And as a writer, you're doing this kind of, Proustian analysis, or I don't even say analysis, you're kind of dialoguing with or monologuing with what it is to be a conscious creature in this world, right? And usually somebody who thinks on that level may feel like the other level of the neuroscientist is alien to them, and they might be dismissive about it, or they might look up to it. That there's many ways that you could look at it, but it's rare to have somebody who's doing both. And so, as with your writer hat on and your neuroscientist hat on, and living as both of these, I think there's a few times that you'd be more confronted with this kind of split identity that you have, or I don't know, is it split or is it joined? I'm curious how you reconcile these and how these last 8 days might have fleshed that out or deepened the chasm. So
what popped into my head as an answer, which I will soon say.
Take your time.
No, this is not a delay tactic, I promise. I have the answer. I could do it if needed. But I think it's a writer's answer, because the only thing my brain did, I don't know how it arrived at the answer I'm about to give, but it did. And I actually, as soon as I thought, I was like, oh, that's actually really, really beautiful. I'm about to give a very strange, beautiful answer. Okay. But it's not scientific. But it contains elements of scientific thinking, or it contains elements of observation. So you can see in this city the artifacts of the change in the water line all over the place, right? And it seems like either the buildings are sinking or the water is rising.
What are they sinking about? Sorry.
And scene. So let me give a possible answer. The scientific thinking that I was trained in, that's the buildings. The writer part of me is the rising water line.
Nice.
I am just slowly destroying my scientific structural thinking as I write more and more, and I move farther and farther away from science. But right now, at this moment in my life, it is essential that both coexist. The beauty of this city, the beauty of Venice, is that there's a tension between that like rising water and the buildings, but the beauty requires both, right? The beauty requires the interaction. The beauty requires the fact that you can literally like take a wrong step and fall into a canal here, and the dead end at water. Mm-hmm. And I feel like sometimes the fellow neuroscientists, talk to me, and they dead end with me because I refuse to sometimes stay in scientific thinking and flip to kind of the writer self. And I do believe that the trend is that I will become overwhelmingly submerged.
But is it because the type of truth that's revealed by writing is more profound or meaningful or important, or is it because it means more to you to engage in the act of writing than in the act of like working in a lab?
I think it's actually a large theme, at least in my conversations at this conference, was how people end up kind of preferring and being the kind of person that their specific configuration of inner mental ability predisposes them for. So, for example, there were debates and questions at this about whether or not someone with aphantasia who has no mental imagery on the inside of their head might be more likely to be a programmer or do something with languages because their visual imagery is a bit deficient. Whereas someone who has hyperphantasia, which is extreme mental images, might be a painter or might be a film director who can see from their point of view 20 feet away. And so it's not the case that people end up necessarily, there's a lot of life, and we kind of find our ways through this kind of navigation of our preferences and our behaviors and our careers and our choices kind of based on what we're good at and what we like. But we're not always in control of what we're good at and what we like. It can be shaped by the genetic and or kind of subjective thing that happens on the inside of your head. And for whatever reason, the first blush response I always have is a writerly response to things. And I trained really hard as a scientist to kind of shove that aside.
Yeah, one of the scientists explicitly said there was a big problem in neuroscience with like an over-reliance on words, right? Yeah. And that the kind of vagueness of words that's like incommensurate with the goals of science. But my takeaway was that we can and must kind of embrace the vagueness as a feature, not a bug in a way. Like I think that, but it's just really been interesting to kind of see this tension up close from an outsider's perspective and see how everybody's battling with it, like their narrative side, their aesthetic sense, their narrative sense, their aesthetic sense, and their kind of empiricist sense. And like, obviously people lean towards one, towards the other, and you're saying that now you're leaning a little bit more towards one, but obviously you have this scientific mind as well, as much as you might deny it.
But ultimately my dream future is Kevin Costner from Waterworld. I'll be riding on a small boat of scientific reasoning, but it'll mostly be words.
Well,
and with that,
wow, hour and 15 minutes. Shall we have a martini?
Yeah. Does that involve words? Can we order one without words?
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for having me here. It's been such a joy. Hold on, I gotta make a little clap at the end. Boom.
Oh yeah, that's always a good idea.